Hello everybody and welcome back to our series on making a tower defense game in JavaScript, and today we're going to talk about the document object model, or DOM. And I think it's really important to understand that when your browser, whether it's Safari or Internet Explorer or Chrome, reads your HTML content, your HTML content gets sent from a server to your local computer, and then the browser on your computer is reading this HTML text and it's translating it into JavaScript and then loading it into your computer memory as JavaScript objects. And so when we talk about these things in HTML, we talk about them as elements. For instance, there's a head element in the example that I'm showing you, a title element, a body element, and so forth. When they get loaded into RAM, they're JavaScript objects. And when we talk about them in terms of the document object model, we talk about these things as node. Each element gets its own node. So we have a document node, a root element, in this case HTML, and then we have a head, a title, and so every node in the DOM has a parent and a child in this tree structure. So if you look at the body element, its parent is root and it has two children, A, which is an anchor tag, and H1, or a heading tag. And then those guys have children which are both text. And so these things, we type them in initially as HTML, but your browser turns them into JavaScript. So conversely, we can take JavaScript and we can create HTML elements, and we can use, through JavaScript, we can style those elements with CSS-like syntax. Okay, so the big idea here is the browser is going to look through this HTML content, and it's going to interpret the HTML and all the other files it needs to turn these things into JavaScript, and it's going to load these things into JavaScript as objects in the form of a tree, in the sense that these things will all be linked together. A parent can have more than one child, but each child has exactly one parent. And so the HTML DOM is a standard object model and programming interface for HTML. And so it defines several things. For instance, it takes HTML elements and turns them into objects, and it also takes the properties of those elements and turns all of those properties from the HTML elements into objects. The methods to access these are all given in the spec, and we will be looking at several of those in this video. And then we have also events. So this asynchronous event, that when something happens, it triggers an event that can cause some code to run. So for instance, if I click the mouse, or if I drag the mouse, or when the window is loaded, an event will occur, and then I can call a specific function at that time. And so not only do we take the HTML and turn it into JavaScript, but with JavaScript we can create HTML elements, and we can also change them, add, delete them, and we can style them. And so that's the big idea for today. Okay, so here's a simple example of some JavaScript. This would be in my JavaScript file linked to my project through the head of the HTML file. But this JavaScript basically says window.onload. Onload is an event. When the window is done loading, it's going to trigger that event. And it says equals examples, so it's going to look for a function called examples. And if it's there, it's going to run the code in that function. So I have, for instance, var heading equals document create element h1. So the create element method is, notice I go into the document and I create element h1, and so it creates this element, and it really doesn't do anything with it yet. It's just sitting there in memory. It's not linked in any way to my page. I'm creating a second var called heading text, and now instead of create element, it says create text node big head. And so those two things are sitting in memory as nodes kind of alongside my project. They don't get added to the tree until I say document.body, that's where I want to add them, append child. And so when I say document.body.append child heading, I'm looking at the body and I'm taking the heading and I'm appending it to the body. So it gets asserted into that DOM tree structure right under the body. The body now has a new child called heading. And I can also do the same thing with heading.append child heading text. And so my heading got appended to the DOM tree, this tree of nodes, and so now the heading text gets appended to the heading. So this is how I get these HTML elements in to my DOM tree, and this would appear just as if I had written it in HTML. So here's some common DOM functions. We have var header, document.createElementH1. So header doesn't become part of the page until it's appended, so I have to say document.append child header. So now the header is going to be a child of the document. Likewise, if I say element.append child header, then I have the header is a child of some element. If I say var x equals document get element by ID, then JavaScript is going to look through the entire DOM tree, and it's going to look through, or the entire tree of the document, and it's going to look for some element with the ID name in this case, and it's going to load a reference to that element in variable X. And then I can use that to, for instance, style it, I can delete it, I can change it, I can do what I want, but a reference to that element is loaded in variable X. I can also get element by class name. And in that case, this guy's going to return an array of references, and it'll look through the entire document, and it'll give me everything that has a class name of whatever I'm looking for, in this case, class name. And finally, I have element style. And so the style background color red, you can see that this background color looks a little bit like CSS syntax, but there's no hyphen. And so this is actually JavaScript, and so a hyphen wouldn't work as a name, but element.style, that allows you to do CSS background color in this case and change the background color, whatever that element is, whether it's the body or the background of a div or what have you, to red. Okay, here's some more quick examples. You can go ahead and set the CSS text color by doing element style dot CSS text. You've got set attribute. You can also do the color of the text and so forth. And we can also use the context to draw things. So in this case, I've got CTX as my context, begin path, context.arc. I'm going to talk more about the context in the next video, context.stroke, but just so you can see an example, in this case, I'm creating an arc, and I could create an entire circle if I went all the way around 2 pi radians, but you can see that this guy, let's say this guy is we want the center of this arc to be at 175. I might want the radius to be 50. I've got the start angle at 0, and the end angle is going to be 1.5 pi. If I put 2 pi radians there instead of 1.5, I would draw a complete circle. And I'll do that also in the next video. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to open up Atom, and I've saved a file called test.js. Notice it's in the same folder as the rest of my project. And I'm going to go ahead and back into index, and I need to add a link to that. So let's go back here and say Control C, copy to my clipboard, and I'm just going to link to test.js. So that matches this name here. If I save that, and I save this guy as well, I can add some of the code we just looked at in here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and see how this page works. I've got almost nothing in here right now, just window unload examples, and I've got an empty function down here called examples. So as soon as the page is done loading, it'll trigger the onload event. JavaScript will look for this examples function and find it here. And so let's go ahead and give it a little bit of code. I want to create a div to put the heading in, and so I'm going to say var main div. Now this is going to be a JavaScript variable. It's going to have a reference to this element, and it's going to be a div element. Right now it has no name or ID, but it says document.id append child. So I'm going to append this to the body object that's in the document, and so I append child main div. Notice this guy's not in quotes. And so if I do this and run it, we are not going to see much happening, but the div is there. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit more interesting. So now I want to add perhaps a header in here and some text, and so let's put that in. So it's going to create a couple of elements in an otherwise empty HTML page. So I've got a variable called heading, which is going to be a heading, an H1 element. And so I'll create that, and it'll be attached through the document.create element. And I'm going to have heading text, and so this is document.create text node. In any case, this is the type of element it is, and this is the text that's going to eventually appear in that. And again, if I ran this, nothing would happen. So we can see that I've actually made these things, but I haven't appended them yet to anything. And so if well, actually I've appended the main div, but now I'm going to take main div and append child heading. So now the heading is going to be a child of the main div. And if I look at this now, let's see what happens. Nothing. And that's because I didn't append the text to this, so there was an empty div, doesn't show up as anything on the page. So now if I run it, I get big head. So this is actually inside the div. So that we can see the div better, let's go ahead and give it some more, let's say style. We'll style it a couple of different ways. The first way we're going to style it is I'm going to go ahead and just set attributes. So just like in a regular HTML tag, that tag can have attributes inside the first tag. I'm going to go ahead and call this a style, so a style attribute, and I'm giving it some CSS rules. I have a property width, value 800 pixels, property height, value 400 px, border 8px solid blue, and so forth. And I can say main div dot style dot margin auto, and then finally I'm going to add one more thing. Well, let's actually go ahead and run it right now and see what this looks like. So I've got it saved. I'll come back in here. I'm going to run this, and there it is. It appears, big head right in the middle. Now if I come back here, I'll put one more line of code in, and it's going to say background color light green. If I come back now and run this, and now the background turns to light green. And so I'm styling, I'm creating an HTML element. Actually, I created a couple of HTML elements, styled it. Okay, so that's our introduction to the DOM, and we're going to need some of that information as we continue on. In our next video, we'll look at the canvas and the context and how to create a simple animation on a canvas. And that's it for today. Bye-bye.